I'm so happy to be here today and have an opportunity to spend some time with our new director of program here at Fulcrum, Miss Devika Sood. And Devika is just um, a wonderful person, a wonderful story, and someone who we trust will bring a lot of guidance and support to the students and the educators in Oakland around literacy. So, Devika, thank you so much for joining. I really appreciate it. And if you don't mind, I just like to ask you a few questions so that people can get to know you.
Absolutely. I'm ready.
Okay. So, well, first, why don't we just start off with you sharing a little bit about your background as a person? I'm not talking about work, but just who are you?
Yeah. Um, I think um I think the first piece of my identity is probably rooted in the fact that I am a first generation immigrant. I was born in India and came to the States when I was 2 years old. I spoke Hindi as my first language at home and English at school. And I think something that's important about that is my experience at school as a multilingual learner. I was very much in my silent period and really was monitoring my speech until about second or third grade, which is when I finally started kind of speaking aloud in class. And I remember being part of ESL at the time. That's what it was called in the 90s, early 2000s. Now it's called ELD. And I actually really remember appreciating my one-on-one and small group time. And I remember my affective filter was lowered and I was gaining a lot of confidence as I was practicing. And then had that confidence to go and speak in my class. So I think that's you know, an important part of my identity. I think another piece is that I have ADHD and I'm neurodivergent. And I was diagnosed with ADHD when I was 6 years old. Um, and at the time, especially during that time, there wasn't as much language and research around it, and my family just did their best to support me. And I remember going through the IEP process and having my mom really advocate for me. She really advocated for me to get things like extra time on tests and larger projects and a separate space to take a test so that I could really focus and do my best. And she would ask for copies of assignments so that she could redo them with me and practice with me one-on-one. And I think she just understood that I needed more time to process and reread things. And I would often pause to think about things deeply and sometimes go off on a tangent and then remember that I'm reading and come back to the text. And I remember feeling really understood and supported by my mom. Um, and conversely, having experiences at school that were different, teachers that weren't as supportive, some teachers that were pretty resistant around accepting my learning disability, maybe because it was less like visible to them. Um, and I remember being in an IEP meeting and a teacher telling me that they would give me accommodations, but only with the words grade modified on my report card. And so I remember feeling of that feeling of not really feeling like my teachers understood or knew how to support me or believed in my ability. Um, and I think like a third piece around my background um, is that I'm a child of abuse and household dysfunction. And I think that created a need for safety and consistency and love and inclusion, and school was that place for me. Like, even though like I might have had some negative interactions with teachers, or at times I was bullied by my peers for race, language, culture, distractibility in class, like all the things. Overall, like it was a place that was predictable and consistent and really kind of was an escape. And I remember there being a few teachers in my school experience that were really impactful in their ability to have a warm demander stance. And I felt their love, but I also felt their high expectations matched with like a belief in me and a confidence that I could do it. And one of those people was my third grade teacher, Miss Clark. Shout out to Miss Clark.
That's right.
And I remember we were doing endangered species reports in third grade. And I picked the California condor, and I drew the most beautiful scientific drawing and typed out my whole report and turned it in. And I thought we were done, but we had to present our report, which at the time I was in my silent period and I was not really speaking in class. And I just really did not want to participate in that. And I fake sick on the day that I was supposed to present. And then the next day, she told us that we were going to do the makeup presentations, and I fake sick halfway through school so I could go home and didn't have to present. And then the third day, she was just like, you're going to do this, and she had everyone, all the kids came to the library, sat down, and I was in the middle on the little beanbag chair, and I whisper read my entire report. And I just remember feeling like she wasn't going to let me off the hook, and that like I was going to do it and that I could do it. And I remember feeling like, even though that was hard, feeling so happy and proud of myself that I accomplished that.
You talked about being neurodivergent and also a student who was learning English as a second language. There are a lot of folks who are concerned of having second language learners over-identified to be in special ed or to receive accommodations, etc. Do you think overall that you're going into SPED and getting resources in IEP and different supports, was that an overall plus for you? Did it undermine your self-esteem at all as a student or as a person? I'm just curious to know your reflection on that. I have a bunch of other questions to ask you, but I'm curious about that if you don't mind.
Yeah, I mean, I think overall it was really positive, because without those accommodations, I would not have been able to show what I know. And for example, I remember my sixth grade humanities teacher was very resistant to giving me my accommodations. And we had this state writing test. Every sixth grader had to take it. And you got two scores, you can get a 6 and a 6, and the highest score is a 12, typically kids, right? So I went into another room. I did my essay. I think it took me most of the day to write my essay. And I remember getting the scores back and him coming to me and saying, "You got the highest score in the class. I can't believe it." And without the accommodation, and I think it really changed the way that he perceived me and the way that he treated me, because I think he just saw my lack of focus and my inability to keep assignments organized and all of these things as just like laziness, for lack of better phrase. Like, I think he thought I was lazy or just not smart. That's the feeling I had at 12 years old. But, and then I remember his dynamic really changing towards me after that. And so I would say in general, like having the supports I had was super helpful. And of course, like, yeah, there might be some feelings of like, going through the process. But I do think ultimately having a name for my diagnosis was really helpful for my family. My mom had a big book that said how to handle a child with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, like a fat book. And she really had the words to be able to understand and the tools and resources to understand how to support me. And without the diagnosis and without the support that I received, my second language support, I don't know if I would have excelled.
And also, you don't know what the attributions would have continued to be. Is she lazy or is she this? I mean, just his response, your teacher's response saying, I can't believe it, gives you a sense of the expectations for you. And sometimes our expectations need to be challenged as adults just as much as anything else related to what a child can or can't do. Okay. Thank you for sharing that. I really appreciate it.
So, Kareem, I know you asked about multilingual learners and me being neurodivergent and multilingual learner and having an IEP and kind of speaking to the thought around over identification. And I think my response to that, aside from my experience of it being positive, my family knowing the language and how to support me, how to advocate, me essentially getting accommodations so that I could actually show what I know. I think for schools that are thinking about that, or feeling some pressure around that, I would say err on the side of getting the data, because once you get the data, the screening data, it's going to illuminate things, right? Because data is a flashlight, it's not a hammer, and it's going to tell you a story, right? And it's going to help you make an informed decision. And that data can point to, for example, with my last network, it pointed to a tier 1 overhaul, right? We're going to change our curriculum. It could point to a tier 2 increase of support. Maybe we need to hire a role to give intervention, or maybe we need to hire a literacy coach to increase implementation of tier 1, right? So I would say that if you have enough students where there's a pattern where you're worried about over identification, then typically that's going to be a system change, or it's going to have a bigger implication on the program, because it's pointing to an instructional gap, not necessarily a student ability. And so I would say ultimately the data is actually going to have some positive ripple effects on the system, right? It's going to give objective information from where you can make decisions. So yeah, that's what I would say is get the data.
Also, hoping that you'll share some of your journey as an educator. Can you talk a little bit about your background as an educator and the different roles you've been in and how those have gone for you?
I think my background as an educator really stemmed from my experience, right, as a child and going through the school system. It's what drove me and led me to want to become a teacher, and really
Mhm.
gave me this passion to want to create a classroom experience that was safe and loving and inclusive and consistent, where my kids knew I believed in them and that I held high expectations for them. And I think because I had faced a lot of deficit mindedness around my abilities, I really wanted to reframe that and come to my students and my families with an asset lens, and really like including their backgrounds and languages, and making meaning really like engaging, and making learning engaging and meaningful to them, and making sure I met that with support using a variety of modalities, like researching all the best practices, like how kids learn, and really ultimately wanting them to feel successful and really having them build their agency over their learning. Um, so that's kind of the why of what
Right.
brought me to the work.
Right.
Yeah.
And so that
And
you were, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
no, go ahead.
So you began, my understanding is that you began as a teacher in elementary, right?
Mhm.
And you had that lens, that asset lens there. I don't want to skip anything. Can you just
Yeah.
kind of walk through the different roles you had?
Yeah. So I would say, like, my experience, that's kind of the why. And then my experience as an educator, I think there's a few impactful moments. One is sort of the training I received, and a couple pieces of training that really shaped me. And I think one of them was just having an amazing mentor in my student teaching program that really, emphasized the value of family and bringing families into the classroom, and emphasized not just bringing them in, but giving families a role in the classroom, a role as teachers in the classroom. And so I had that early on, an example of how powerful that was, and I continued that. So in my kinder classroom every morning, the first 20 minutes we had read and greet, and families would come in and they would read with kids, theirs and other kids. And that's how we started our day every single day. And I would have two or three family members in my classroom help teach a center. They would get to know the center. They teach the same center every day. They'd really like master how to teach that. And not only did this give my families insight into what their child was learning and what the grade level expectations were, it also maximized my instructional time. And I was able to run differentiated groups. So I think that collaboration with family and that partnership was really impactful. And I think another piece in my education journey that shaped me was this TK network that I was part of when I first started teaching. I started teaching transitional kinder, and at the time, there wasn't a standard set for TK, because they were still taking the kindergarten and the preschool standards, kind of finding a middle ground. And so I was able to be part of this community of practice where we really did a lot of standards deep dives to understand, what do transitional kindergarten students need to end the school year with. And I really had this grounding in brain research and how students at that age learn the best. And it kind of sparked this curiosity around the neuroscience of learning and really understanding child development. And that, I think, was integral, because it really helped me root all of my instruction in standards and best practices and research. And I don't think, like, that network kind of sparked that whole passion. And so I really am thankful for that. And I think another piece was my training in college, my teacher prep program. Um, I was trained in whole language, and I remember a professor telling me, or telling us, all of us, like, don't worry. all kids are going to learn how to eventually read. Some at the age of 6, some at the age of 11. Just have a print-rich classroom. It'll happen. And I remember that moment in class being like, this is a well-respected professor, but I just do not, that just didn't settle well with me. And I'm so lucky that I had this TK network after my teacher prep program that really like grounded in research and not, and like really grounded in neuroscience of learning. And I think that kind of helped to counter that. And it started this like trend where I was always kind of researching best practices. And it got to the point where, as a kinder teacher, I was just throwing spaghetti at the wall. Like I was like, Haggerty, core, seeds during transition, SIPS groups, tons of read alouds, lots of opportunities to act it out, draw it out, speak it out, like discuss the text. And I was actually getting some pretty amazing results, like 90% proficiency results, like year after year. And even during the pandemic, when I taught through a screen to 27 kinders, we were able to have 80% of our students proficient in their phonological awareness assessment, decoding CVC words and encoding, and also high accuracy on their decodable passage. And I just remember feeling like, okay, if I just keep learning best practices and trying things on, and I could find that flow of like, okay, I'm going to do some phonological awareness. We're going to do differentiated groups. We're going to make sure there's a connected text. We're going to talk about this complex text and all the ideas going through. And I think, yeah, all of the experiences I had shaped me to be that kind of educator that was seeking things outside of the programs I was trained in. And that really shaped me.
Do you think it matters having a person with, I mean, you have second language background, you have divergence going on, you had a lot of stuff going on, you have experienced your own. I mean, do you think that makes an impact, or how does that show up when you're in a system leadership role around literacy and how you're trying to get students and teachers going in a particular direction?
I think having this experiences that I had and the being neurodivergent, I think it definitely drove me to want to make sure that all my kids were
Mm,
successful. And I
mm,
think when I had that in my mind of like, I know that all kids can, and I'm going to aim for that. And I was really relentless about that. And um, I think that's, and I think I'll bridge to the answering the question, but I think that's what really led me to get the results I did. And then to be able to be put in a position where now I was a teacher leader for a K2 grade level band, right? And I was I was sharing what I'd learned around the science of reading with all the K2 teachers as around learning to read, but also centering the text and spending time in text to make meaning of text. And so I'm leading this like literacy work with K2 as a teacher, to be able to kind of widen what I've learned, right, across many classrooms. And then as a teacher leader, I also led our universal screening for dyslexia. I think at the time we were one of the first networks to pilot or adopt a universal screener. And I also remember, being on the instructional leadership team, and and I don't think a lot of people liked what I had to say, if I'm being honest, but I said it anyway, and I felt really strongly about it. And one of the things that I was pushing was for there to be a measure around fluency beyond second grade. And I felt very confident that our students' ability to decode and read automatically was directly affecting their ability to comprehend and make sense of what they were reading, and that we should shift that, and that that's a key lever. And ultimately, what we were talking about was how to increase achievement on our state assessments, which are comprehension based. And so I just, I was maybe not the most liked person in the room, but I just felt like that was right. And I was then, promoted to director of elementary academics, where I was finally able to implement some of those system-wide changes.
So we at Fulcrum had been engaged with organizations like the NAACP and others, um, who which had been advocating for screening um, across the city. Now there's a new state law that's going to mandate screening for risk of learning difficulties, including dyslexia, and I think it's coming in the next year or two. But you and your team responded to the push from some external folks and did the work behind the scenes to figure out if that's something that would benefit students and teachers serving those students. And you went forward without giving too many details about how it all went and everything. What did that teach you? What did you as a leader glean from that experience of leading that initiative?
Yeah, I think it starts with choosing the assessment. We went through a process of reviewing different universal screeners, understanding what was the time, what was the format, what were the measures how were the measures delivered? Was it one-on-one? Was it computerized? And based on our conditions and our context, we wanted to choose one that would give us screening data, that would act as a benchmark, that would allow us to progress monitor, and would have survey level assessments in case we wanted to investigate more. And all of that was housed in one platform. And we were able to make student growth goals within the platform, and it would track students' progress towards meeting or not meeting those goals. And so for us, it really felt, or for my previous network and my role there, it felt like that was the right choice because our assessment suite was full. It didn't feel like I could implement something that wasn't complete. Like it wasn't going to just be sort of like if it was added on and then some was done on paper or other formats, it just didn't feel like it would integrate well. So we chose one that would work well for our context, give us all the information we needed to make data-informed decisions, have data be presented in a way that was visually digestible to stakeholders, was important to us. So I think spending time on selecting the universal screener was important. I think some challenges was definitely assessment time, right? Because you want to think about the instructional time that it takes to, get to like 95% completion, because otherwise then it's not really worth adding an assessment if you're not going to get above that 95%. And so taking the time to work through those challenges, right? Like, what is the frequency? Do we do it 3 times a year or twice a year? Is it for all K-8 students or is it for K-2, right? We took time to figure that out. Year 1, we did it one way. Year 2, we revised and did it another way. Ultimately, we decided, okay, K-8 was all going to at least get a couple assessments. So especially 3rd through 8th was definitely going to get a fluency assessment. And then we were able to select measures for K2 and 3-5 that made more sense, right? And so I think we were able to overcome those challenges, just being realistic about the conditions. But I think ultimately what drove that new assessment system to be successful is coming back to it and using it regularly to make decisions. So we looked at it every benchmark period. We had time for system, site, and educators to look at the data and make an action plan. And I think if you're not using the data and it's just external facing, it's really hard to create buy-in from your leaders because it's not actionable. And so I think also that was something that led to the success.
I appreciate that because we have so many different assessments that we give, and sometimes you wonder what's the point if I'm not going to use this stuff, if it's not actually going to help me and the students that I'm teaching, then what good is it? So to hear that from you, that reflection is really powerful and a reminder for system leaders to think through the actionability of the data that's and the format, the substance, um, and the accuracy and the timing of the data, all that matters when you're trying to justify whether or not it's worth giving in the first place. So
Yeah, I think definitely. I mean, being able to screen kinder through eighth grade students is a huge success. And ultimately, having the data be really usable and drive decisions is super successful. And so, from that data, we were able to, some other key initiatives were implementing a new tier one curriculum. We added a phonological awareness curriculum to the kinder suite. We added a new tier two intervention curriculum. And then obviously we adopted this universal screener, which also acted as a K2 dyslexia screener that embedded it, that like tied into the benchmark scores. So it was a lot of change, right? Like that's a tier one, two, and assessment. And I'll start with challenges. Challenges for tier one when you're implementing a new curriculum. For the first 6 to 8, I would even say up to 8, like 6 to 8 months were challenging. Like it took time to align on the why. Like, why are we spending time pronouncing phonemes and not adding a schwa? Like, why is that important? It just took time to understand the why. It took time to internalize the structure and routines of the curriculum, to internalize or at least align on what activities and tasks teachers could supplement with that were aligned to the science of reading, and what did that look like, and which were not aligned to science of reading, what does that look like. It took time to do side-by-side coaching to build the capacity of our site leaders to know what is it that I'm looking for in this literacy block. And I think ultimately all of those challenges, the way that we overcame them was finding a curriculum that had high usability, had a low entry point, had predictable routines, was a low lift in terms of prep. All of that helped in terms of implementation success. And I think a turning point was, month 8, when our first grade teachers see that the majority of my kids started with learning their letter sounds and decoding CVC words. And now the majority of them are decoding vowel teams and multisyllabic words. And seeing how systematic sequential instruction really helps students grow, and it's growth that you can tangibly see within a relatively short period of time, a year. And that helped year 2, because that created a bunch of buy-in. And year 2, I felt like we weren't working on buy-in. We weren't working on, the why. We were working on, okay, how can I make it better? And how can I drive more results and more proficiency in my classroom?
well, it's interesting to me to hear your reflection because that's a lot of change for an organization, for individual teachers, for schools, and as an organization. Change management is really tough, and getting people to hang in there and be willing to adjust their practice to something that's different that they didn't necessarily learn in their graduate school program or the credential program, or something that they may not have done their last school, and to be willing to try it um, before the results come, to full-heartedly go for it is an art in and of itself. So there's the technical aspect of teaching and learning. There's also the leadership and the change management that's required to actively and consciously get buy-in and not just wait and hope that it works out. So I really appreciate that. So then you leave that environment. I mean, I have to admit, I was watching. I have my eyes on folks around the city and around the country, and I run to a lot of folks, and I saw the work that you were doing. It's compelling. I really wanted, your partnership with Fulcrum, and but then there's your side and your transition from a system leadership position to now coming as a director of program at a nonprofit like Fulcrum, which is rooted in advocacy for better literacy outcomes and also partnership with systems, et cetera. I'm wondering, what do you hope to do? What do you hope to get done as director of program for the organization?
Yeah, I think before I go into like my hopes for this role, I want to back up and I want to highlight like a few more things in terms of successes and challenges that I think would be really beneficial to folks.
Mm.
Um, I want to talk a little bit more about like the tier 2 curriculum and that change. So year 1, we just did a double dose model of tier 1 that are reading interventionists repeated in extra groups essentially. And we just didn't see as much growth as we wanted. And year 2 is when we changed our intervention curriculum. And we chose a curriculum that had more multisensory instruction, more visuals. It was more intensive. The rules were explained further. And ultimately, we also decided to more closely progress monitor. So I think those two things of changing the curriculum to be different than tier 1, what is like the different layer of support that tier 2 is giving that tier 1 curriculum program isn't? And then how closely are you progress monitoring to make sure that kids are actually responding? And
Then
so,
they will eat me up if I don't ask you what the curriculum was that you transitioned to. People are going to
oh,
say, "Could you just tell us what was it? What did you
yeah.
transition to? What was a shift that you all made?"
Okay, so tier 1, we adopted bookworms, DI for our foundational skills. And we also added really great reading countdown to the Kinder suite for phonological awareness. Because DI starts at the alphabetic principle and has some phonemic awareness, we wanted to make sure that kids had phonological awareness before starting DI. So phonological awareness, really great reading countdown, bookworms DI. We did a K5, foundational skills, 60 minutes a day. And then we added really great reading HD word for tier 2 intervention. And then Ames Web Plus was our universal screener that we used for screening, K2 dyslexia screening, benchmark, and progress monitoring. And so our reading specialists were using bi-weekly, we're progress monitoring students who are receiving intervention to see if it was working and what additional supports were needed. And we had a master schedule, thinking about leaders, right? We had a master schedule that allowed for teachers to have a 60-minute dedicated foundational skills block that protected that time. That was it was clear to everyone that literacy is the priority. That also helped with implementation, right? And then another key initiative was I was able to change our reading interventionist position to a reading specialist position. So we could add literacy, leadership, and coaching to their role. So now there was someone at each site that was holding literacy. And, there was a challenge around our principals and assistant principals holding ELA coaching and math coaching, the meaning making strands, language comprehension strands of ELA and math. And the frequency that foundational skills coaching was happening wasn't quite enough to make shifts in teacher implementation. And now having a reading specialist that was acting as a literacy coach, right? So they did some of their role was direct intervention, and then some was coaching. And they're at the site, they're on the ground, teachers are coming to them with questions, they're walking through and giving real-time coaching. They're meeting grade level teams or bands to help with internalization and prep. And they're really owning the data at their site. And I think that was a huge aha moment, because it was really hard as a central leader to hold implementation success at sites, and having someone that I could work with and build the capacity of to hold at their sites was really impactful.
That's a structural change that was made as well, as
Mhm.
opposed to one individual doing some coaching when they can get to you. That's different than having someone at a school site who's designated for a specific role. That's a structure that's put in place to support literacy.
Mhm.
I get it. Okay.
And I think that, along with, I would say the last initiative was establishing a foundational literacy committee. And in that committee, there was multiple roles. So director of academics, principal or assistant principal, reading specialist, MTSS coordinator, and director of special ed. And having that cross collaborative team was very important in establishing this literacy system, and multi-tiered system of support, right? So that we all were so clear on what are the achievement and growth goals of all of our students. This is our collective, responsibility, right? We each have a piece of the system, but we all have to kind of work together to make student achievement happen and to achieve student success. And so we had really clear achievement goals. We want X students to be X proficient by this date, right? And have this much growth. And then we had just regular data cycles. So we started with meeting every 2 weeks and then meeting every 6 weeks. And we would use data from either the curriculum embedded assessments or from the benchmark, or from progress monitoring. And we always looked at data together and thought about what were the implications in terms of coaching, and where principals and assistant principals might need to collaborate with the reading specialists to support with coaching, or where are students who might not be responding to intervention, what kind of additional supports can we layer, and who's going to give that support, just increasing the bandwidth for support since we're a team. And then progress monitoring, to make sure that kids are moving. So I'd say that team and that committee, having some kind of cross-functional committee that holds and looks at data together, was a success.
Devika, you've talked about system leadership in terms of structuring a literacy program in the science of reading and making sure that it's productive for kids and the teachers who serve them, as well as your work as a classroom teacher and a K-2 lead. But I'm also curious to know about your work as a building leader and the role of leadership at the site level when it comes to literacy initiatives. Can you speak a little bit to that as well?
For the last year at my last network, from about after fall break through the end of the year, because of some transitions and roles, I became the assistant principal at one of our
Hmm.
sites. And
Well, hold on.
I,
You were assistant principal, but weren't you also? But so
yeah.
did you? So you did two at once.
Well, we tried to get as much off my director plate as possible, and I just held literacy, um, and then really leaned into the assistant principal role.
Okay.
Um,
Okay.
and you know, I think that was the place where I realized that I could design something that is so beautiful and it meets all six pillars of reading, and like every research like practice is in there,
Checks all the
and
boxes. Right.
right, like checks all the boxes, and then it's really honestly it's only the design is only as good as its implementation. And the context at the school site is we had new teachers, 0 to 3 years. Half of them were on intern or long-term sub credentials. So not even like not yet like in the process of becoming teachers of record. And I quickly learned like and emerging needs coming up each day, understanding what are the choice points and what is flexible, and also what are the priorities, and making that really clear. Um, Making it clear to staff that literacy is the number one, and having that from that baseline was really important. And then also knowing that the key initiative that I held as assistant principal was coaching, right? I had 11 teachers that I was coaching, and I needed to understand all the different ways that I could coach, right? So whether that's the PD day, grade level team meetings, or one-on-one coaching, like the different structures that I could give feedback and support teachers, which teachers needed what, right? Like what format worked for who, depending on where they were in their implementation, right? And so I think a key learning for me was inspect what you expect, right? So regular learning walks met with supportive coaching, whether that's one-on-one grade level huddles or whole group. And it really did help to have a site leader who was so in the weeds and really was locked into the program and what the expectations were, because I could double up on the support that the reading specialist was giving, right? So um, I was able to do more, you know, give more support than if I had it, if I didn't have the knowledge or I wasn't as internalized in the curriculum. So I think having a site leader who has that is key to implementation.
That goes into instructional leadership. And there's a role for operational leadership and management, but instructional leadership and the ability to support the learning journey for educators is is seemingly undervalued. There was a time when I know one local network used to actually split operations from instruction, but it became too expensive of a model and they abandoned it. But the principle is the same. You have to have someone who's holding instruction for people and helping them grow along that journey. Could you tell us, like, what was one of the biggest opportunities um, that you faced, challenges or opportunities? And then what was one of the bigger successes?
I mean, an opportunity for me, just as an individual, was coming from central office and kind of coaching the coach, like coaching assistant principals or principals to then coach teachers, and
Mm.
then being in a position where I could directly coach 11 ELA teachers was huge and a huge opportunity. If you're thinking about an opportunity as a challenge that we needed to overcome, I would say the challenge was the knowledge base that our teachers were coming in with, right? So like knowing that we had novice teachers or intern teachers or long-term sub teachers, what is the amount of lift they can hold, and what's the capacity, and what's the best way to build that capacity, and how much, how soon, right? Like, do I teach, like really thinking about phases of implementation. So first, we're just going to roll out the structure. Like, what's your structure for managing the literacy block? Now we're going to add small groups. Once you roll that out, now I'm going to think about the integrity to the lesson. Great. Now I'm going to think about coaching you on what are kids doing when they're not in your group with you, and what are the materials that they are doing to really maximize their literacy instructional time when they're not in small group. So I think the opportunity was working with more novice teachers and understanding how to coach them in a way that's sustainable for them, in a way that's attainable and makes them feel successful. Yeah, and then matched with the expectation that, and the priority that we have to teach reading. Yeah.
You know, I love your help in working through university partnerships and making sure that folks coming in have a foundation in the science of reading, have a foundation in, or have a basic proficiency level with how to teach children how to read. So I look forward to partnering with you on that, because a lot of models out there, but the universities have a role to play. The alternative pathway programs, the whatever way people are coming in, they've got to come in and hitting the ground running. I mean, you're talking about people who are on intern credentials and emergency credentials, whatever the designation is. They've got kids. They're in front of kids during ELA time, and they need those lessons. And so, how do we make sure that they at least have a basic level of proficiency that they can teach a child to read today? So, I look forward to partnering with you on that. But that leads me to my last question, which is, your work as a director of program for Fulcrum. I mean, the acronym says it all. Full and complete reading is a universal mandate. To hear you come in as a director of program, and so I'm curious, what are you trying to get done? What's your vision, your mindset in terms of what you can do, what you want to prioritize, and I'd love if you just lift that up a little bit.
Yeah, I think my hope coming into this role was really to widen and increase my impact, right? Like, I was able to impact as a teacher leader, as a site leader, as a central leader, and now I'm able to have this position where I can impact across different networks, and really scale the learnings, knowing that conditions are different in each context, but there are some key moves that folks can make that will help in their implementation of a structured literacy program. And being able to learn from both my, you know, successes and my opportunities, right? Like things that I learned along the way, like how to build buy-in and understanding the why, having a carefully vetted and aligned curriculum, like ensuring that you have MTSS supports built out, having somebody at site holding the initiative, like a literacy coach or reading specialist, making sure you have a universal assessment, and then continuously improving and looking at the data and evaluating if it's working and improving your systems, right? And those are things that all systems can use pieces of that, um, and make that change happen. And I think, my hope is to inspire and motivate and support building the capacity of leaders to implement these changes and ultimately see increases in student reading achievement. And, you know, uh, my hope is also on the other side to hold stakeholders accountable with support, right? Being transparent about the criteria by which we recommend tools or programs, and also supporting folks that are willing to make the shifts. You talked about teacher prep programs. So if teacher prep programs are willing to make those shifts towards having courses that are teaching teachers the science of reading, we can support that, right? We can connect resources to those programs. And ultimately, my hope is that Fulcrum can pull those key levers and remove roadblocks and accelerate and increase leaders' ability to then increase students' ability to read and make meaning of text. Because ultimately we know that literacy is a social justice issue, and explicit and systematic and sequential instruction is the key to unlocking 95 to 100% of our students' ability to break the code and think critically about the text. And I think the ultimate message is or learning that I have from this is that I'd like to also make sure I pass on is just stick with it, because working through the change management process, knowing that implementation science tells us that it's going to take 3 to 5 years to successfully change a system, and that results may come after, just helping ground leaders in a stick with it attitude, because when we implement these things, the change will come and the results will come.
Devika, as you were ticking off the list of things you wanted to do and recommendations you were making, in my mind, I could literally see the equivalent the equivalent statement in the NAACP's literacy petition. That Fulcrum was a part of that. I mean, we were, along with about 10 other nonprofits and universities and other folks, that said, these are the things we want to see. There were 8 demands, and they filed it a couple of years ago with OUSD. And I'm just thinking off the things you rattled off. And it's just a reminder to me that it's not that they're glitzy and glamorous, but those are the things that have to be done to move the needle. And so I appreciate the alignment. I don't know if you were thinking about that, but the alignment, it just, when people are doing the work, those are the things that have to be done. And it may not be glamorous, it may not be buzzy, it's not a silver bullet, but that's the work. And so I applaud you for your journey, for the things that you've done, for your willingness to share a little bit about yourself and your intentions in your role of director of program at Fulcrum, and your expertise. And hopefully this will open the door for others to consider some of the things you've said. And then also they might want to reach out to connect with you. Is there a way that folks can connect with you, reach out, whether it's to get feedback or your thoughts on certain things? How can they connect with you, if you don't mind?
Yeah, they can email me, Devika at fulcrum-oakland.org. That's the best way. And I think it'll probably be included in this newsletter intro.
Okay, you bet. All right. Thank you so much for your time, Devika, and welcome to the team.
Thank you.